Welcome everyone to tonight's presentation from the Santa Cruz Museum of Natural History. My name is Marisa Gomez and I'm the museum's Community Education and Collaboration Manager. We're excited to dig into the local caves of our Santa Cruz Mountains with Dr. Jessica Oster today. And before I hand things over to her, I wanted to just share a little bit more about the museum and why we are hosting this presentation tonight. So the museum is a nonprofit organization. We're located in the Seabright neighborhood of Santa Cruz, and we've been connecting the people of this region with nature and science for 118 years. We were Santa Cruz's first museum. I have not been there for all of those years, but for some of them, and it's a great honor and privilege, and love the museum. The land on which the museum exists and the land on which I'm streaming into you from is the traditional and unceded territory of the Yupi tribe of the Awaswas Nation. Today, these lands are stewarded by the Amumutsin tribal band, and the Amumutsin are working hard to fulfill their obligation to Creator, to care for and steward Mother Earth and all living things through relearning efforts and the Amumutsin Land Trust. We hope you'll visit us during the run of our new exhibit, Underground, Unearthing Unseen Worlds, which is on view now through November 12th. And this exhibit explores the mysteries of the world beneath our feet, from its critters to its caves, while also considering the legacy that humans are leaving on our underground world, for better or for worse. We've got some live animals in the exhibit. The famous mastodon tooth is on exhibit. So if you were following the international news story extraordinaire of this early summer, you can come see the tooth for yourself now through November 12th. We hope you come check it out. And then I also wanted to share that we'll be communicating with you tonight via the chat. So one thing that you can do is it typically defaults to sending your messages to me and Jessica, but it's lovely for everyone joining to be able to see what it is that you have to share, or your questions. So you can go ahead and change that option from host and panelists to everyone right now, if you like, and you can practice using the chat by sharing another little factoid about you in the chat. What's your favorite critter that spends time underground? I'm a big fan of badgers, personally. Been seeing a lot of snakes this year more than the past, so those come to mind. Love to hear from y'all. And then we're going to be welcoming in tonight's speaker. So I'm going to share just a little bit about Jessica here. There she is. So Dr. Jessica Oster is an associate professor of earth and environmental sciences at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. She completed her PhD at the University of California, Davis, and has spent a long time studying our local caves here in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So we're going to be learning about that research today. So I will stop sharing my screen and welcome in Jessica. Hello, Jessica.
Hi, thank you so much.
We're really honored to have you join us from, are you in the East Coast right now?
I'm in Tennessee. I'm in Nashville.
Nashville, so yeah, 2 hours
in the middle.
ahead here.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I guess I will share my screen.
Perfect.
There we go. Same photo here. Excellent. So, well, thank you all for listening tonight. I'm excited to tell you a little bit about the research that I do in caves in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and also just how we use caves to understand the climate of the past and the relevance of that for understanding the future. So Marisa gave you a pretty good introduction to who I am, but I have a little bit about that as well. As she said, I'm a professor at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, so that's where I am right now. And I started my studies in geology at Oberlin College in Ohio. I got my PhD at UC Davis, so I spent a lot of time at that time studying caves in the Mother Lode region in the Sierra Nevada. I spent some time on the peninsula working at Stanford, and that's when I started to get to know the caver community in the Bay Area. And then I moved out here to Nashville. I guess I also spent a little bit of time in Sweden on a Fulbright where I got to climb a glacier, and I'm very impressed with myself for that. And that's why we have a picture of me I'm one of the dots back there on the glacier, but had a lifelong love of caves. I grew up in Kentucky going to Mammoth Cave, which is the longest cave in the world, and was really excited in college when I learned that I could apply. I could learn about climate change and study caves for a living. So that's kind of where I got my start. But then a part of my job that I love today is that I get to introduce caves to a bunch of other people. And some of those people are students of mine, but I also have taken teachers. I've taken my children's elementary school classes caving. It's really like fun to be underground. I know it can seem a little bit intimidating. I was really intimidated by it when I started. But as I've gotten more experience, I realize it's a place, it's beautiful. It's challenging. It can help you learn a lot about yourself and feel really close to your teammates. And it's just a really wonderful part of my job to get to introduce this science and the love of caves to other people. So I hope I can do a little bit of that for you guys here today. Okay, so my goals for this talk are first to describe how and why we might want to understand the climate of Earth's past. So we'll think sort of big picture first, and then how we can use cave minerals broadly to try to do that. So why is it interesting and how do we do it? And then I'll get into the specifics of ongoing work that I've been doing at a particular cave in the Santa Cruz Mountains that we call White Moon Cave, and how I've been using minerals from that cave to reconstruct past rainfall and also past fire activity. So that's where we're going. And I just want to kind of start then with this question, which is a question that I put towards all of my students in my classes on the very first day, which is why do we do this? Like, why do I do what I do? And so many people who study similar things in my field, why do we study the climate of Earth's past? And then I like to show them this figure, and I'm going to start by only showing you a very small piece of it. This is a graph that on the x-axis is showing you time, with the future over here and the present somewhere in here and the past here. And on the y-axis, what we have is a temperature anomaly, so big delta T. And you'll notice this little black line. So this black line is our historical record of temperature. And this is from actual measurements, actual data from weather stations all over the world, aggregated together, going back to about 1850. So right here are all, if you can see my cursor, are all of the measurements that we have about Earth's temperature. And what we've done is we've taken an anomaly, we've put it relative to the average of the middle of the 20th century. And so that's why we see right around here in the middle of the 20th century, that part of our temperature curve plots on the 0 line. So everything that's above that is going to be greater than that time period, and everything that's below that is going to be lower or colder. So here's the information we have. What we see is historical. And then we have these curves here, the red, blue, and darker blue. Those are all projections for the future. And they are based on climate models that are all run using different scenarios for what we might do as humans. So the red line is if we are emitting a lot of CO2, a lot of greenhouse gases, it's our business as usual. We keep doing what we're doing. And then the blue lines are more and more optimistic. So maybe we are able to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and we turn things around faster. But for all of them, you see that we have kind of large increases in temperature that are happening into the future. So this gives us some perspective, right? But if we look back at just the historical record, where we're going in the future based on these model projections is nowhere near like what we have seen in our historical written record. And that, sort of disconnect is where information from the paleoclimate record can really help us. So now I'm going to reveal the rest of this figure. And you can see the rest of this is all information from what we call paleoclimate proxy records. So a proxy record, or a paleoclimate proxy, is some biological or geochemical evidence that's preserved in a material such as ice, wood, dirt, or mud, or different minerals that tells us something about Earth's past climate. It's a representation. It was there at the time that the climate was recorded, right? And it's telling us something about what it saw. And we can use this information to make inferences about what climate was like in the past. So what you see on this graph, going back in time, and you'll notice that our time axis here is nonlinear. So we get further and further back in time, all the way back to 60 million, so just after the extinction of the dinosaurs. We can see that we have all this information that tells us that there were big variations in temperature back in time. These green and teal curves are from ice cores. NGRIP is the Greenland ice core. Epica is the Antarctic ice core. And we can see that, for much of the last 300,000 years, temperature was pretty cool, right? As we go further back in time, we no longer have ice that we can get to that's that old. So we start to look at records from marine sediments, from ocean floors, and we're looking at the chemistry of microscopic fossils in those sediments. And if we look at this, we can see that, by the end of this century, in this red projection, we're really looking at temperatures that are maybe something more like 5 million years ago, right? The mid-Pliocene, for example. So the paleoclimate record can tell us this, can be like, okay, here's a potential analog for where we're going. What was climate like on Earth at that time? And what can we learn from it that might help us understand, where we're going? So that is why I became interested in paleoclimatology. And the kinds of materials that we look at for this information are very diverse. There's all kinds of things we can look at. There's ice cores, like what I showed you, sediments from the ocean or from lakes, like this sediment core, tree rings we can look at. We can look at mountain glaciers and date the record of their advance and retreat. We can look at fossilized pollen and all kinds of things. And that tells us about the vegetation, the plants at a given place at a given time. And this is one place where you can find fossilized pollen. This is actually a pack rat midden. Pack rats live in the desert, and they'll gather all kinds of vegetation and bring it home. And then they actually pee on it, and the pee solidifies that mound, and it stays there. And over time, as generations of pack rats occupy the same place, it builds up. And so we can sample that and say, okay, here's a record of the vegetation of the past. And pack rats, you can find these middens in caves as well. But what I like to work with is the thing over here. This is a stalagmite, and that's what I'm going to spend most of my time talking with you about today. Stalagmites are really helpful for preserving climate information from the past. So if we want to understand Earth's past climate, we need a few different things. We need a material like that, like a stalagmite or an ice core or a pack rat midden, and we need to make measurements in that of some paleoclimate proxy. So this is an image of a stalagmite that's been cut in half, and I've put it on a micromill, like a computer-operated dentist drill, and drilled little bits of powder out of it through time down its growth axis where it was growing. And I've measured something called oxygen isotopes in that, and that's going to tell me something about Earth's past climate. But in order to understand what it's telling me, there's some other things that I need. One of those things is that I need to understand when it grew and when each of these little data points, like what point in time it's telling me about. So for that, I develop what I call a precise chronology, which means that I date different parts of the stalagmite. And I typically use a technique called uranium thorium dating, which is a radiometric dating technique, a lot like radiocarbon, which you might have heard of, but it works back further in time than radiocarbon does, and it's a little less complicated than radiocarbon. So it works well on stalagmites. So I need a chronology. I need to know when in time we're talking about. And I also need to know what this thing that I'm measuring is telling me. What about climate is it recording? Is it temperature? Is it rainfall? Is it, how vigorous the plants were respirating above the cave? And to do that, I need to understand the modern cave. I need to see what those parameters are telling me today so that I can make inferences about what they might have been telling me in the past. So once we have all of that, we have our record from one place and we can say, okay, here's this record of oxygen variability in a stalagmite, and it's telling me about rainfall in this one place. And I can put it together with many different records from many different places and records from different times and try to build out a more complete record. So this is just a representation of several stalagmite records from a Chinese cave that have been overlain together to create climate information going back 650,000 years, which is impressive for this kind of record. Or you could look at a snapshot in time and look at things through space. So that's also really interesting. This is an aggregation of climate records across the Western US that all record the last ice age about 20,000 years ago. And then what I like to do is take that information and compare it to paleoclimate models. So like the same models that create those scenarios for the future also model the climate of the past. And we can use that to say, hey, how good are these models? And also what are we learning about past climate and why it was different? So that's a big part of my research as well. Okay, so I've been throwing around some words. So what is a speleothem? It is a fancy term for any secondary mineral deposited within a cave. Could be any mineral, and it could take any shape or size or form. It just has to be something that grew inside of the cave after the cave was formed. So in this picture that was the opening of my talk, we have several different kinds of speleothems. We have stalactites that are hanging from the cave ceiling. We have stalagmites that are growing up from the cave floor. We have columns that are joined between stalactites and stalagmites. And we have some other things in this cave as well. For my purposes, what I like to use are the stalagmites, the ones that grow up from the floor, because their growth history is a lot more regular than some of the other forms. So if I took a stalagmite from here and I picked it up and I cut it in half, I could look at it and I would know, okay, the oldest stuff is on the bottom and the youngest stuff is on the top. And that's very helpful when you're trying to create a record through time. What else is really good about speleothems for climate? Well, something that's great is that they grow in caves, and caves occur in anywhere where you have bedrock that dissolves away. So anywhere where you have limestone or marble or other different kinds of rocks that are soluble in acidic water. And this means that we have them a lot in the low and middle latitudes. So if you think back to that first graph I showed you, we saw an ice core and we saw marine sediments, and those are really good for giving us kind of a big picture global average. But humans don't really live so much in Greenland and Antarctica. Only scientists live in Antarctica, right? And we don't live at the bottom of the ocean. So it's really nice to have climate records from places where we actually live. And speleothems or stalagmites give us that capability because they exist in places that we exist as well. There are many different things that we can measure in a stalagmite to tell us something about climate change. And so that's really exciting because we aren't just reconstructing one aspect of climate, we're reconstructing many different things. And then their ability to be dated using this uranium thorium method is actually really awesome and makes them really good for paleoclimate research as well. This is a map that shows you, it's a little dated now, but everywhere where there's a published in the scientific literature stalagmite record that you could go read about. So you'll see there are definitely some out in California and from the Santa Cruz Mountains that you could learn about. And I'll tell you about one of those tonight. So how does this work? Well, this is like the intro figure from the Speleothem Science textbook, which does exist, and gives you an overview of everything that's influencing your stalagmites chemistry. So here's our little cave system, and here we have our stalagmite growing. And they grow from water that drops, periodically down and precipitates a little bit of mineral, and that grows up and up and up over time. But that water, the chemistry of that water reflects, everything that happened before it got to that point. So, I mean, it evaporated from the ocean and it rose up into a cloud and it fell as rain. And when it fell as rain, it interacted with the soil, it interacted with, first maybe any aerosols, any anthropogenic, outputs, any things that like plant communities, farming, anything that was going on the land surface. So there's a lot of potential for speleothems or stalagmites to tell us about all of these different processes, but it also means that the records can be pretty complex. And so that's why it's important to have that understanding of the modern cave system as well. Okay, so let's talk about where you are. So this is a map from this thing that I found on the internet, so you can read it too, the Cave Fauna of California, published in 2017. And it's a map of caves in California, and the shading is caves per county. So you can see where the most caves are in California. It's including a lot of different things as caves. So to give you some idea, lava tubes are considered caves. So there's lots of amazing lava tubes in California. And this top image up here is from Lava Beds National Monument. And that's up in Northern California. And you can explore these lava tubes that formed in igneous rocks, which are very cool. There's also talus caves in California. This is from Pinnacles National Park, not too far away from where you are. These are caves that are formed from giant boulders falling into canyons and creating essentially giant rock piles. They're very cool, and I highly recommend checking them out. You can have caves that form in limestone, which is like typical caves, and that like out here in Tennessee where I am, most of the bedrock is limestone, and we have tons and tons of caves. I think more mapped cave passage than any other state here in Tennessee. But you also have these caves in California. This is a cave up in the in the Shasta area, just around Lake Shasta, called Samwell Cave. And then you have caves in marble. This is a cave in the southern Sierra Nevada in Sequoia National Park, called Lilburn, that's in a marble, which is a metamorphosed limestone where you often get these beautiful bands. And so going inside of this cave is really beautiful. I've been inside of that cave. And you can also see here in Santa Cruz, you've got a pretty dark green color and a lot of little red dots. So we can zoom in on that. Here is a geologic map of the Santa Cruz area. And, California geology is kind of all over the place, right? We have rich geologic history, there's faults, you're right on the edge of the ocean, and a lot of stuff has been pushed up onto land over time. And that means that there isn't like a big, continuous limestone like we have here in Tennessee, but instead we have these little pockets of soluble rock. And so all these little blue pockets here are marble units, and that's where your caves are in the Santa Cruz area. So the one that I work in is in one of these units up here. But even right on the Santa Cruz, UC Santa Cruz campus, there are caves, as I'm sure many of you know, and those are down here. I just thought I'd throw this in here. So there's a lot of biological diversity in these caves. And because of that, and for other reasons, it's important to protect them. So very recently, cavers associated with the San Francisco Bay Grotto helped to create a wildlife permeable gate over Empire Cave, which is located on the Santa Cruz campus, and I think has long had a reputation of being a place to go party. So the inside of it has been not treated very well, and there's a lot of graffiti. Cavers, I think, will go in every once in a while and clean it up. But just recently, this is from just August, a gate was put on this cave to allow the wildlife to pass through, but to keep people out. So lots and lots of caves to access or to know about, at least in the Santa Cruz area. So my research involves caves all over the Western US. These are some of the places that I work. And what I'm going to talk to you about for the rest of this time is White Moon Cave, which is located very close to the Santa Cruz Mountains. So in all of these caves, I mentioned that a big part of my research is understanding the modern system, trying to see how signals of climate and environmental change might be transmitted from the surface into the cave. So to do that, I spend a lot of time underground and making regular visits, and I also use a lot of instrumentation. So this is just a schematic of what we might do in a cave system. So we might start by sampling the soil above the cave and putting in some things to some different data loggers. We put in gas wells to sample the soil gas, or we might sample the soil water. We put data loggers inside of caves, things like drip rate loggers that tell us how quickly water is flowing into the cave and dripping on stalagmites, temperature and humidity data loggers, CO2 data loggers. And then we sample a lot of water. And as you can imagine, each time we visit the cave basically gives us one data point. And we want to know how the cave is evolving and changing and recording information over long periods of time. So each set of data points, is one trip. And so we try to make multiple trips, maybe once a month, maybe once every season. We collaborate with local cavers in places where we don't live, or with the staff in places where it's a commercial cave, so that we can build up these data sets. And that's because every cave location is unique, and there are some inferences that we can apply across multiple places, but really it's important to know your own cave system and understand what it's trying to tell you about climate today and what that might mean for climate in the past. Okay, so White Moon Cave is located in a quarry outside of Davenport. And it's currently gated. It's not open to the public. It's managed by Post and by the Western Cave Conservancy. So we work with them to gain access to the cave, and they are excellent collaborators to work with. The quarry has cut the cave in pieces. So there's entrances on both sides of the quarry walls. We tend to visit one side, but this is an anthropogenic modification of the cave system. It is not the most photogenic cave, and based on looking and like what I know about the Santa Cruz Mountains, like the caves are pretty tight and twisty and not very photogenic, but fun, and have a lot of interesting biodiversity as well. The upper level of the cave is pretty is not that challenging, but you do have to sort of walk through tunnels like this and stoop and go around corners. But as you go deeper into the cave, which we sometimes do, it does get more challenging. This and I've only actually done this once. I send my students down there. They seem to like it though. So this is a hole that you crawl into. This is a hole that you pop out of. This is actually me going through something that we call the ear dip, where half of your face is submerged and you're sort of crawling along. You emerge from that crawl that I showed you over here. So this is a tight cave when you go down deep into it. Some of the things that we've done at this cave, we have sampled soils from the surface. We're doing this for a few reasons. One of the things that I'm going to talk to you about in a bit is trying to reconstruct past fire activity from stalagmites. And so something that we're looking for in the soils are different biomarkers of fire that we can measure, different organic compounds, but we also look at other minerals in the soil. Within the cave, we place things like drip rate loggers. So this is an acoustic logger that will take a measurement every time a drip hits it. And that can tell us how quickly, like when it rains on the surface, how quickly do we see that signal inside of the cave? We collect drip water. This is a large bottle where we're collecting for those fire biomarkers, but we also collect really small samples, like 2 milliliters, for something like oxygen isotopes that's really concentrated in water. And then we also grow calcite in the cave on these glass plates that we can take home to the lab. So this is sitting on top of this logger, and over time, we'll get some mineral precipitated on it, and we can take that back to the lab and analyze it. And that tells us something about, what would actually be recorded in a stalagmite today. And then this picture was in Marisa's opening, but this is an auto sampler. This is something new that we've put in the cave. It has a carousel in it that collects 58 samples, and you can set it to rotate at a given time, so we can, without visiting the cave as often, get more water samples. And it's working okay. As you can imagine, electronics in very wet, humid, dirty environments don't always work as you would hope they would. But we've gotten some good information out of it so far. Here's what some of our data look like. So this is the drip rate data, and I'll show you this over here first. So this is for about a year, summer 2018 to 2019. And here's rainfall. As you know, in California, we mostly get our rain in the winter and the spring. And as you can see, the drip rate in the upper level of the cave responds almost immediately, like very quickly, to rain falling on the surface. And the signal also decays away pretty quickly. So we think that water is flowing into this cave rapidly through fractures, rather than being stored in pore spaces in the rock and dripping through more slowly, which we see in some other caves. Here's data from the upper level of the cave from this last spring when we had all those atmospheric rivers. And you can see this is the drip rate. Got very, very high at times, in response to storm events, and then decayed slowly back almost to zero over the summer. So very dry in the summer and very wet in the winter, and also very flashy, we would characterize the drips in this cave as. And that becomes important when we start to look at the paleoclimate record. Okay, so here is a stalagmite from this cave. So this is a quarter of a stalagmite. It's been cut in half and half again, and it's laying on its side. So the youngest top part is up here, and the oldest bottom part is over here. And you can see it does have bands, but they aren't really like tree rings. We can't attribute them to being seasonal. But they do tell us something about what's happening in the cave. We've dated this stalagmite with uranium, thorium, and those are all of those numbers that you see there. And the part of the stalagmite that we've focused most closely on is the older part. So what's grown between 8,600 years ago and 6,900 years ago. We were excited to see these ages because it covers a period of time in what we call the Holocene, so the last 11,000 years, where there was this known climate event that happened that had not yet been recorded on the West Coast. So we were excited to see if we had that event in our record. So that event is called the 8.2 kiloyear event. It is something that happened 8,200 years ago, and it was first recognized in the Greenland ice cores. So over here, we have the Greenland ice core record. This is oxygen isotopes, but it's telling us about temperature, and down is colder. And if you look here, right where this box is, this little divot, that's the 8.2 event. And what it was a 150-year-long cold snap that happened. And we saw it in Greenland, and then we started seeing it in climate records from all over the world. The idea for why this event happened comes from evidence from geomorphology, from looking around Hudson Bay. So right around that time, we had a big lake, a proglacial lake, right where the Great Lakes are today, that was sitting up against the remnant of the big ice sheet that occupied Canada and was melting back after the last ice age. There's evidence that there was an outburst from this lake of cold glacial meltwater that flowed through Hudson Bay and into the Labrador Sea. So we had lots of cold, fresh water, and this had perturbations that rippled throughout the climate system, because the North Atlantic right there is a real center point of where ocean circulation and atmospheric circulation come together. So if you perturb that area, there's things that can happen all over the world. And so down here, here's a map from 2013 that shows you everywhere where we've seen the 8.2 event as of about a decade ago, that's expressed in terms of a change in precipitation. So brown dots represent drier, green dots represent wetter. And what you'll see is that in the Western US, there were no dots at this time. So we were excited again by the dates of our record at Whiteman Cave. So we measured several different things in the stalagmite, and I'll show those to you here. So paleoclimatologists like me look at a lot of wiggly lines. Here at the top is the Greenland ice core zoomed in. So again, down is colder. This black curve is a Chinese stalagmite record that's telling us about the strength of the East Asian summer monsoon. So a downward shift is a weaker monsoon, so drier. So during this time, cold in the North Atlantic, dry in China. What do we see in California? Well, what we focused in on were these records here. This is blue curve is carbon isotopes, and the purple is phosphorus concentrations in the stalagmite. And what we saw during this event was not so much a mean shift, but a change in variability. So we see, especially in carbon, these rapid up and down shifts that occurred during the 8.2 event and leading up to it. And we thought this was interesting and wondered if what we're seeing was intervals of real pulsed infiltration, punctuated by dry intervals, and potentially some climate volatility or climate whiplash, oscillations in between extreme wet and extreme dry conditions. Now, this is very interesting. It's very interesting in California today because it's something that we are experiencing right now, this climate whiplash, and it's something that's projected to increase. These are images from a model scenario that's that same fossil fuel intensive red scenario from the first graph published by Daniel Swain. And in this, he saw an increase in by the end of the 21st century in the frequency of extreme droughts and extremely wet seasons, and those two things occurring adjacent to each other. So climate whiplash. A very visceral representation of this is if we look at Lake Oroville in Northern California at the end of the 2012 to 2015 drought, it was at this very low state. Only 2 years later, after some big winter rains, we breached that spillover, right? So climate whiplash, oscillations between extreme wet and extreme dry. And this is something that's in the news all the time in California. These are headlines from several different years highlighting how we're thinking about this and how this pertains to the water infrastructure in California. So identifying this kind of phenomenon back in time and looking at it and understanding why it happened then and what the implications of that were could be important for the future as well. So all of the records that I showed you up to this point were telling us relative changes. It was wetter, it was drier, and that's a lot of what we can do in paleoclimatology. But there's a big push to move things into the more quantitative realm. How much wetter, how much drier? And a graduate student in my group who just graduated decided to apply a new analytical tool to try to put some numbers on this record. So he was using, his name is Cam DeVette, and he was using calcium isotopes, which is a newly emerging paleoclimate proxy. So how does this work? So this is a little bit technical, so bear with me, but there is an interesting outcome, I think. So calcium isotopes are something that are particularly sensitive to a process that happens in a cave, which is called prior carbonate precipitation. So as water flows from the soil into the limestone or marble bedrock, it dissolves some calcium carbonate. So it has some calcium ions that it dissolves. If that water then flows through the fractures and the, pore spaces above the cave and it meets an air-filled pocket or it flows very slowly, it could precipitate essentially a speleothem, some calcium carbonate, before it gets to your stalagmite. And that act of precipitating some carbonate early changes the chemistry of that water. And the degree to which this happens actually reflects how quickly the water is flowing through the system. So if we think about calcium isotopes, that water flows in into the limestone and it dissolves some calcium carbonate and it takes on the calcium isotope fingerprint of that rock. So its chemistry looks like the rock. As it flows into those fractures and pore spaces, if it precipitates any mineral there, its chemistry, its chemical fingerprint is going to change. What happens is that one version of calcium is more likely to go into the mineral and one is more likely to stay in the liquid, and we can measure that using our measurement techniques. So then that water flows out, it grows your stalagmite, and that ratio is captured in your stalagmite. So if we were to look at two different scenarios, one where you had relatively less precipitation, where it was wetter or drier, and one where you had relatively more, we are going to see more of that precipitation of calcium carbonate happening in the drier scenario. And so our stalagmite is going to look less like that limestone value that we started out with. So Cameron measured these things, these calcium isotopes in our stalagmite, and this is the record that he got down here in blue. So here in green is the carbon isotope record, and in purple, the phosphorus, which I already showed you, where we have those rapid oscillations. And this is the 8.2 event. And what he saw was, indeed, we do have ups and downs that happened during the 8.2, and they were, one after the other, up, down, up, down. So this tells us, yes, there were oscillations. The magnitude of them was not as large as we might have expected based on the carbon isotope record. However, if we look before the 8.2 event at around 8,300 years ago, we have this really big change. This actually happened during something called the precursor event, which is related to the very first release of water from that proglacial lake into Hudson Bay. And that's been noted in other paleoclimate records as well. So we were interested to see that. Another thing that's interesting about calcium isotopes is that you can use all of that information from the modern cave system to try to figure out exactly how much wetter or drier, or make an estimate of how much wetter or drier it was at a given time. So we use information like the glass plate calcite, the drip water calcium isotopes, and the host rock, the limestone, and we use a function and the modern rainfall to estimate what the rainfall was at a given point based on our speleothem measurement. So we did this as well, and we transformed our calcium isotope record into this record that you see here. So on this axis here, we have estimated annual rainfall now, and we have our blue curve, and the dashed and dotted lines are the average or the rainfall averages in clusters of water years in the last decade. So the 2012, 2016 drought, 2019, 2021, and then that really wet cluster 2017 to 2019. So you can see the range of annual rainfall experienced in Santa Cruz over those years. And you can see our calcium isotope curve for 8,000 years ago. And we oscillate in between those extremes a lot. But then during this precursor event, our record actually exceeds what we saw during the last decade. We did some statistical analyses on our carbon isotope record, and indeed that pulled out the 8.2 event and the precursor as having more variability. So we think that this is still pointing towards more volatility during that event, and especially during this precursor event. Okay, so last section of the talk. The other thing that we're interested in this area is understanding paleofire. And this is very important across California. At this site in particular, it was impacted by the CZU lightning complex fire in 2020 that influenced a lot of the Santa Cruz Mountains. Our site was right in the thick of it. So this is an aerial photo from a farm that is here, that is right on the edge of the quarry. Here's the quarry, and you can see the burn going right up to the edge of the quarry. Inside the quarry was a place where people were actively trying to contain the fire. And the water supply for Davenport actually goes through the quarry. You can see this is the pipe in 2023. This is the remnant of the old water pipe that burned in 2020. So there was active fire right at our site. And so this got us thinking, how would we study this? What would we look at? What would we measure? And what would this look like in the paleoclimate record? So to look into this further, we teamed up with some chemists from the University of Mainz in Germany to measure a compound called levoglucosan. Levoglucosan is a sugar molecule that is produced during the burning of cellulose. So it's uniquely a fingerprint of biomass burning or of fire. It can be produced in anthropogenic ways from residential burning, coal burning, or agricultural burning, but it can also be reproduced in forest fires. And it travels through the atmosphere. It's airborne for about 3 days. And then it lands on the earth, and it actually moves through systems really quickly. It's very soluble, and it's a sugar, so things like to eat it. Bacteria like to eat it. So we were curious if we would see this signal in our cave. We also decided to look at another thing that would tell us something about vegetation. We looked at what are called lignin oxidation products, or LOPs, and the ratio of these different organic molecules in your system will tell you something about the type of vegetation that you have. You can fingerprint whether your cave system is covered by more woody vegetation versus grass or herbaceous vegetation, or angiosperms or gymnosperms. So this can tell you, is the vegetation above my cave changing with time? So we wanted to see, could we see the 2020 fire in our cave? Unfortunately, we were not able to get access to the cave because of the fire and the damage done to the area, and because of COVID safety concerns, until December 2021. So a whole water season passed, or water year passed, before we were able to get back into the cave. We analyzed some archive drip waters that we had from 2019 and February 2020. And then we measured the water we were able to collect in December 2021. And what we see is that the 2021 water, the triangles, is not elevated in this sugar over the 2019 water. The 2020 water is quite high. And when we looked at the CAL FIRE record, there were several small fires around the area in the fire season in 2019-2020. So we think that's what we are capturing. We also see a change in this concentration with depth in the cave. These two sites are much shallower than this site. So we think with levoglucosan that it washes through the cave really quickly, that we probably missed the 2020 fire in our waters, but that it might also be sensitive to a larger region than right above the cave. We also looked at this in our stalagmite, and these results were published last December. The lead author was one of the chemists from Mainz. And down here is our levoglucosan record compared to these other records that I've shown you. So to walk through the whole thing, our calcium isotopes show rainfall variability outside of the modern range, especially in this precursor event 8,300 years ago. Our carbon isotopes indicate increased variability of precipitation. Phosphorus is telling us that there's more organic material washing into the cave, which can tell us about infiltration and rainfall, but also might suggest fire and biomass burning. And in levoglucosan, we see a peak right during this event, indicating that there was elevated fire activity during this 8.2 event, and that it corresponds for the most part with this time that we saw elevated climate whiplash. So that's interesting. That could point to a connection in the past between climate whiplash and fire. Now, we also looked at these LOPs, lignin oxidation products, and I'm showing this to you as what we call a mixing model. So in the corner with the shading, we have our different plant end members. Softwood, woody vegetation versus hardwood, woody vegetation, hardwood, non-woody, softwood, non-woody. And here's our modern calcite, which plots really well with the current sort of coniferous forest above the cave. Okay, so we have a shift that happens right after the precursor event from less woody to more woody vegetation. This shift actually predates the rise in levoglucosen, predates the increase in fire, but postdates that big swing in infiltration and rainfall that we saw. Then after the 8.2 event, we see a shift back towards less woody vegetation. So the shift follows the large swings in the calcium and carbon that tell us about rainfall, but comes before the change in fire. This is actually very similar to relationships between climate and fire and vegetation that we see today in forests and that we see in the paleo record from lake sediments, indicating, okay, maybe we had a climate change that led to a change in vegetation. We had more woody vegetation that might have provided more fuel for a fire. And that would have fed back as well by like burning away any seasonal non-woody vegetation. So interesting results. We have a lot more questions about what these proxies, what these measurements are telling us. And we actually, have some observations and outstanding questions. So caves in this region are really interesting. They can capture interesting events, including intervals of enhanced climate whiplash. We're investigating in our group, really, we think, cool new tools for putting some numbers on how rainy, how dry, to understand past climate change, as well as looking for new ways to understand past fire. But there's lots of questions for these things. We want to know, what is the range of the levoglucosen signal? How long does it hang out? Are there other biomarkers, such as these polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that hang out longer that we could look at? And I'm part of a big collaborative group where we are looking at these things across California, from Northern California at Lake Shasta Caverns and through the Sierras all the way down to the Southern Sierras. So there's collaborators from UC Davis involved in this, as well as other places like Utah, Connecticut, and Ohio State. And we're hoping to look back 65,000 years with the records that we have. If you would like to read more about my research, the work that we do in Wyoming at Titan Cave, which is the cave with the pretty stalagmites that I've shown you the pictures of. You can read this article that came out in High Country News about a year ago. We had a really awesome journalist join us for one of our field excursions at a pretty difficult cave, and you can read all about that. And then I also want to say, if you want to go caving in the Bay Area, you have a really amazing group of cavers who you can link up with. This is an image, just a screen capture from their website, the San Francisco Bay Grotto of the National Speleological Society. Definitely only explore caves with experienced cavers and people who have access to the land. Don't go explore caves on your own if you don't have access and don't have experience, because it can be quite dangerous. But there's lots of resources to get out there and get involved if you are interested in doing so. And with that, I'll say thank you. And I guess maybe take some questions.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. That was so fascinating. I was telling you before the talk that I really didn't know a lot about our local caves, and now, a whole new world is opened to me. And I do have a lot of questions for you, and I hope that the people joining us will share their thoughts and questions too, so y'all can use the Q&A or the chat. I also have the ability to allow people to talk. So if you would like to be able to unmute and ask your question or share something, you can use the raise hand function, and I'll try and keep an eye on that, and I can let you talk. So please feel free to chime in that way too. So I have one kind of basic question for you about what you were just saying at the end here, which is cavers. So I always thought that people who explored caves were spelunkers. I'm just curious why the distinction of terms.
So cavers like to be called cavers. I've asked people why spelunkers has fallen out of favor, And I haven't gotten a great answer, except that maybe it sounds kind of old-fashioned and silly, but maybe somebody else can give a better answer. But you should, people who go caving, the thing to do these days is to call them cavers.
Okay, that's really good to know. Thank you for that. And then another question. So I was just hosting a little staff trivia at our most recent staff meeting about the exhibit. And I asked, as one of the trivia questions, what specific cave feature you were studying to get this information. And there was a lot of arguments about like, well, if it was a stalagmite, couldn't it have been a stalactite? And I'm curious if there's a reason why you're specifically focusing on stalagmites. Is it because they're easier to get to because they're on the base, or is there a distinction between what you can learn from a stalactite and what you can learn from a stalagmite?
Yeah, so stalagmites are just much easier to use because their growth is a lot easier to understand. If I go all the way back to one of my first slides, which I can do on, yeah, here. So down here, here's a stalagmite that's been cut open, and you can see it's got these bands and it's kind of flat on the top and it tapers at the side. It's like a series of nested parabolas. And when I look at that, I can sort of tell, okay, the drip was dripping here, like in the same place through time, and, you know, growing mineral in these nested parabolas. And you can also tell if the drip moves back and forth. And when we analyze this chemistry, we want to know what, like, the mineral that precipitated right at the beginning as the drop fell, because as soon as it starts to grow more calcite, its chemistry changes. So we want to know first precipitation, and that's easier to see in a stalagmite. It's also easier to tell what's older and what's younger. So if you date things and your numbers come back out of order, you know you have a problem with your stalagmite. A stalactite, they can actually be really complicated. They can start out as hollow tubes called soda straws, and their water can flow down the middle and precipitate at the bottom. But then as they start to get bigger, like that might clog up and water might start to flow down the outside. And so when you cut one open, they kind of look like a series of parallel lines. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to know what's older and what's younger. It can be just a little more complicated. So since we like to build records through time, we feel like the time component of that is easier to see in a stalagmite versus a stalactite.
That makes sense. And then I guess I'm also curious, so the fire component of your research, it sounds like you thought to ask that question because of the CZU lightning complex fires. So that happened, you're like, I wonder if these stalagmites can also tell us about that type of event too. Is that the way that it went down?
Yeah, I mean, we were thinking about it. People have been thinking about it. Other groups have thought about it as well. But I think with the fire, I was like, oh, you know, so much is going through your head, right? You're like, this is where I work, you know, these are people I know. But it also seemed like, you know, an opportunity to see what it would look like. And I guess I had thought about looking at fires in the past, but I hadn't acted on it until that moment. And then I was like, oh my gosh, this is happening. What do we look for? And then we started talking to other people, and like independently, other groups were thinking the same thing. And there's lots and lots of interest. There's actually a lot of really awesome paleo fire research in caves that happens in Australia. People in Australia have been looking at this for longer than we have, because they have a similar climate to California, lots of fires, and they have lots of caves. So lots of cool stuff coming out of there as well. But yeah, the lightning complex fire seemed like an opportunity to study what it looks like today, which was interesting to us.
Yeah. And you said that you were working with a cohort of other researchers who are studying this throughout California. I'm curious if that includes other types of fire research too, because I know that there's like a paleobotanist who's working not too far from White Moon Cave studying soil samples. And I'm curious if that type of research is helpful in putting your research into context, or if you're mostly focused on cave specific.
Well, so the collaboration that I mentioned is people who are focused on caves, but all of that information is exciting and useful, and it's great. I mean, we learn different things from every kind of archive of the past, right? Like we learn some things from tree rings, or like some facet of it, right? Like they all have different ways of observing the climate system. So putting all of those observations together, we're only going to learn more. And it helps us cross-check ourselves, say like, well, what is my system telling me that maybe you're not seeing, and why is that? And we're always trying to perfect the measurements we make. So information from a paleobotanist, like that's incredibly important for us to, cross-check our results and enrich just the broader knowledge of what happened.
Yeah. And then I guess on that note too, I'm curious about just like our other local caves. So you picked White Moon Cave, but then you also pointed out Empire Cave on the UC Santa Cruz campus. And have you done this research at other caves in the Santa Cruz Mountains? Would you like to? Are there reasons why you wouldn't?
Yeah, I mean, so White Moon is the one that I've worked in. I mean, in large part because it like we work with the Western Cave Conservancy, and they help to manage that cave, and they're good science partners. It's a little harder to get to than Empire Cave has been. So that's good for us because we put sensitive instruments in the caves and we don't want people disturbing them. So it's nice from our standpoint to have caves that are less open to the public or are closely watched. Like I do work in some commercial caves like Lake Shasta Caverns in Northern California, where I work closely with the tour guides and the managers to, when I put an instrument out, make sure that they know it's an instrument and people on tours don't come by and pick them up, which actually has happened. But yeah, so for science, we're trying to find places that are kind of off the beaten path. We also, we harvest stalagmites, right? So we take a lot of the samples that I work with are broken, but sometimes we do take things that are in place. And so we try to work from places where that's not going to impact what other people see or their experience of the cave. So I try to go to like the more out of the way places, basically. And I also need places where there is water flowing. Some caves are pretty dry. And so I can't really measure anything if there's no water to measure.
Yeah. And then, so do we know all of the caves in the Santa Cruz Mountains? It seems like we know where the marble outcrops are, but you were pointing out that White Moon Cave, both entrances on either side are like it's flanked by quarries on both sides. So like, do we know about that one because the quarries were digging away and then all of a sudden we saw this cave? And like I know Empire, like obviously there's an entrance right there, but there's aquifers and I would imagine like complicated karst systems that we don't necessarily like know where the entrances to them are. So I'm just curious, like what do you think we know about our caves? How much do we know?
Oh, I mean, there's certainly caves that we don't know, and places and caves that we do know about that we haven't been to yet. I mean, and that's something that I think the local grotto is really great at, exploration. Like people will do like ridge walks where they go look for cave entrances and see what they find, feel for blowing air. And even like I have a grad student who worked at Mammoth Cave in Kentucky for a while. And part of his job was walking around sometimes looking for new caves, and they would find them even in this national park that's known for its cave, right? That people have been in for hundreds of years. So So yeah, there's always new stuff to explore. And I think that's a big part of the draw for people who spend a lot of time underground.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely a type of person, I would imagine. You were saying that it was sort of like unsettling for you when you first got into it. So, like, are you beyond that now? Are you super comfortable there? And like, what would make you want to study caves if you were, frightened of them?
Yeah, right. I've gotten a lot better. I am afraid of heights, which you would think might not be a problem, but I have found that caving has something for everybody to be afraid of, basically, and like a challenge for everyone. Like you're short, you're tall, caving can be hard for everybody, but I've gotten a lot better through practice. There are still things that I am not comfortable doing and still like challenges that I like goals that I have for myself. Like I have not gotten into vertical caving with ropes, but I know that I need to. So that's like my personal goal is to learn how to be comfortable on a rope. But I have also, as I've gotten older, really come to value things that challenge me and help me, feel good about myself. And so that's been something that's been great. Like facing that challenge has been really fulfilling for me. And I think I've seen that in some of the other people that I take caving to.
Definitely. And that one like really amazing picture that was like the banner or like your very first slide. So that I'm guessing is not White Moon Cave. Okay.
No.
Um, where is that?
Yeah. This is Titan Cave in Wyoming. I'm going there in 2 weeks. Again, it's northern Wyoming, right on the Montana border. And it's a cave that is on BLM land, Bureau of Land Management land, and is managed as a scientific research site. So the only people who go in here are researchers. And this is the only room in the cave that looks like this. The rest of the cave has almost nothing in it. And then you drop down into this room and it's just there's stuff everywhere. It's a very cool spot.
Yeah, very beautiful. And then I guess I just have like one other thing on my mind, unless anyone else wants to chime in with a question. I noticed that Alex is here from the UC Natural Reserves, and so I don't know if he wants to chime in with anything, but I was thinking about like the Empire Cave Doloff spider and the pseudo scorpion, like these endemic creatures that are in some of our caves. And do you like have any experiences with cave dwelling creatures in your work at White Moon Cave?
Not so much at White Moon. We try to be pretty careful about not disturbing any wildlife. We'll find things in the entrance sometimes. Like the last time I was there, we found a frog and helped it leave, so we didn't bother it. But yeah, at White Moon I haven't interacted too much. We try really hard not to interact with any animals and to leave to cave softly, as they say. But in other places I've done a little bit of work in Mammoth Cave and seen some eyeless fish and white crayfish and stuff, and those are really exciting to see out there. But yeah, I'd be happy if Alex wanted to chime in as well. That would be great.
Yeah, Alex, if you want to say anything about like an update about Empire Cave, you can raise your hand and I'll let you talk, but no pressure. And then I do see that someone had written a question in the Q&A, and I think I maybe like jumped ahead of this person, so I'm just going to read it out loud, but it seems like we've touched on this already. They said, thanks for an interesting talk. Does your team incorporate knowledge of anthropogenic fires, cultural burning along the coast? For example, right near your site in Santa Cruz, there is archaeological evidence of increased fire and change in landscape composition. So I think that we were on the same page, FSW, and you and I asked the same question. So I don't know if you have anything to add about that, Jessica.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And I appreciate that reference. I think that's a really great, there's really great work happening integrating paleoclimate and other cultural and indigenous records of climate change. I can think of a really good study up in the Klamaths where they take lake records of that include charcoal and fire activity, and incorporate into that records from cultural burning and things along those lines. And I think that integration of archaeological information and paleoclimate information, like we're still learning how to do that effectively, but it's a really rich and important way for us to take our research forward.
Yeah. And I guess so I'll ask one last question, like on that note, which is that, you know, you've got this new question and then you've got to figure out how to answer it. So have there been any like really interesting kind of challenges in that way about the process of, you know, figuring out the right tool to use or developing these methods?
So what are the challenges?
Yeah, just like you've got a new question and you've
Oh, yeah.
never had to answer it before. And I imagine that you might need to do some like sort of engineering of how to fit, like you interviewing that person in Germany with the help with lignin and whatnot. Have you had to do that a lot? Like figure out as you go along how to, like you're recording this information and then now what do you do with it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, a lot of the work I do, like beyond what I've shown you, is like, what does this mean? Like, what does this measurement mean? And it's different from place to place. So, there is a really like great community of people around the world doing what I do and a vast body of knowledge, but there's also many tools. I mean, going into the modern cave systems and measuring stuff, like that's a really great way to try to figure out what caves are trying to tell us. You can also get a lot of like sort of disparate and noisy information too. So we also tend to model things, like to use chemistry and math and computers to just be like, okay, let me run an experiment and see what I see, and see if this helps to answer the data that I've collected. So I mean, it's all a puzzle, and I think that I enjoy pushing into new measurement areas, new things to look at. I think that keeps it exciting, but it also means that there's a lot of moments where I just don't know what's going on or what's going to happen next. So that is also exciting, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. And then we did get a question in the chat from Bill. He said, I was wondering if powdered limestone were sprinkled on top of Westcliff, would it permeate into the ground and help to solidify the cliff?
I am not sure. You would need it to, I guess, so the hope would be that it would re-precipitate some minerals. And I mean, I guess that's possible. What you would need to have happen, you would need it to dissolve and you would need it to re-precipitate. What makes it possible in caves is that you start out in the soil with like a really high CO2 from the plants, and then that makes the water acidic. And then when it dissolves the limestone, and then it drips down and it meets the cave air where the PCO2 is lower, and that upsets the equilibrium and precipitates the minerals. So it's possible that could happen in a cliff, but you might not have the airflow that you need to make it happen. But I'm not an expert in that in particular, but it's an interesting question.
Yeah, and I think that like the what's it called? I'm drawing a blank, but like the kind of crystals that form in a lot of our sandstones and fossils, it seems like that happens because of cracks, right? So that's probably what you're saying. It's like a crack and then it's air, and then if there were cracks in the rocks, those would get some like veins of yeah. Very interesting question, Bill. Thank you. All right. Well, I think that's all the questions that I have for you, Jessica, but I just want to thank you again for sharing your research with us. And we look forward to learning more about what you guys continue to discover, and hope you can visit the museum next time you're in town visiting White Moon Cave. And I will be following up with everyone with an email, and I'll put some links to resources. I was taking notes, Jessica, with like the article you mentioned and the study that you mentioned about all the different caves. And so I'll be including those in the follow-up email. And there's a little survey you guys can fill out to give us some feedback, including, like future talks that you want us to do. And I'm also just going to drop in the chat really quick a link to our Halloween party. So I mentioned that we're we have our new exhibit called Underground, Unearthing Unseen Worlds, and that is really anchored with our annual Halloween event that we do. This year it's going to be, maybe I'll have you, I'll stop sharing your screen and share mine really quick and just say it's Museum of the Macabre. And this year we're diving into the themes of the exhibit. So we're going to be doing dyeing with mushrooms, and we'll have crystals on display, live animals that burrow underground. We're going to have a movie. We're going to be playing Tremors as the movie. So not like a documentary about caves by any means. And yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. So if you're into this kind of stuff, we're going to be talking about bats too. We're going to have geologists and paleontologists around. So it'll be a great Halloween time, I like to think of. So hope you all can join us. And again, Jessica, thank you for this. When I end this for everyone, it's going to end it for you too. So
Okay.
I'll send you the link to the recording as well. So, and we've got some thanks in the chat if you want to take a look.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Bryn. And thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Great. All right. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.